Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Tuesday night reading stream. I will be continuing reading COVID-19, The Great Reset again. But thankfully, we are no longer on chapter 1. That was finished last week. So now, tonight, we'll move on to chapter 2, Micro Reset. In brackets, industry and business. So we'll see how long this all is. So I will try and get through 2.1 tonight. So I've got the call out on Twitter and all of that. So let's get into it. At the micro level, that of industries and companies, the Great Reset will entail a long and complex series of changes and adaptation. When confronted with it, some industry leaders and senior executives may be tempted to equate reset with restart, hoping to go back to the old normal and restore what worked in the past. Traditions, tested procedures, and familiar ways of doing things. In short, a return to business as usual. This won't happen because it can't happen. For the most part, business as usual died from, or at the very least was infected by, COVID-19. That's a good metaphor. I'll give him props for that. That's a good metaphor. Some industries have been devastated by the economic hibernation triggered by the lockdowns and social distancing measures. Others will have a hard time recovering lost revenues before navigating an ever narrower path to profitability caused by the economic recession engulfing the world. However, for the majority of businesses stepping into the post coronavirus future, the key issue will be to find the opposite balance between what functioned before and what is needed now to prosper in the new normal. For these companies, the pandemic is a unique opportunity to rethink their organization and enact positive, sustainable, and lasting change. What will define the new normal of a post coronavirus business landscape? How will companies be able to find best possible equilibrium between past success and the fundamentals now needed to succeed in the post pandemic era? The response is obviously dependent upon and specific to each industry and the severity with which it was hit by the pandemic. In the post COVID-19 era, apart from those few sectors in which companies will benefit on average from strong tailwinds, most notably tech, health, and wellness, the journey will be challenging and sometimes treacherous. For some, like entertainment, travel, or hospitality, a return to a pre pandemic environment is unimaginable in the foreseeable future and maybe never in some cases. For others, namely manufacturing or food, it is more about finding ways to adjust to the shock and capitalize on some new trends, like digital, to thrive in the post pandemic era. Size also makes a difference. The difficulties tend to be greater for small businesses that, on average, operate on smaller cash reserves and thinner profit margins than large companies. Moving forward, most of them will be dealing with cost revenue ratios that put them at a disadvantage compared to bigger rivals. But being small can offer some advantages in today's world where flexibility and celerity can make all the difference in terms of adaptation. Being nimble is easier for a small structure than for an industrial behemoth. All this said, and irrespective of their industry and the specific situation they find themselves in, almost every single company decision maker around the world will face similar issues and will have to respond to some common questions and challenges. The most obvious ones are the following. 1. Shall I encourage remote working for those who can do it? About 30% of the total workforce in the US. 2. Will I reduce air travel in my business? And how many face-to-face meetings can I meaningfully replace by virtual interactions? 3. How can I transform the business and our decision-making process to become more agile and to move faster and more decisively? And 4. How can I accelerate the digitization and adoption of digital solutions? The macro reset discussed in Chapter 1 will translate into a myriad of micro consequences at the industry and company level. We review below some of these main trends before turning to the issue of who are the winners and losers from the pandemic and its effects on specific industries. 2.1 Microtrends. We are still in the early days of the post-pandemic era, but powerful new or accelerating trends are already at work. For some industries, these will prove a boon. For others, a major challenge. However, across all sectors, it will be up to each company to make the most of these new trends by adapting with celerity and decisiveness. The businesses that prove the most agile and flexible will be those that emerge stronger. Acceleration of digitization. In the pre-pandemic era, the buzz of digital transformation was the mantra of most boards and executive committees. Digital was key. It had to be resolutely implemented and was seen as a precondition to success. Since then, in the space of just a few months, the mantra has become a must, even in the case of some companies, a question of life or death. This is explicable and understandable. During confinement, we depended entirely on the net for most things, from work and education to socialization. It is the online services that allowed us to keep a semblance of normalcy, and it is only natural that online should be the largest beneficiary of the pandemic, giving a tremendous boost to technologies and processes that enable us to do things remotely. Universal broadband internet, mobile and remote payments, and workable e-government services, among others. As a direct consequence, businesses that were already operating online are bound to benefit from a lasting competitive advantage. As more and diverse things and services are brought to us via our mobiles and computers, companies and sectors as disparate as e-commerce, contactless operations, digital content, robots, and drone deliveries, to name just a few, will thrive. It is not by accident that firms like Alibaba, Amazon, Netflix, or Zoom emerged as winners from the lockdowns. By and large, the consumer sector moved first and fastest. From the necessary contactless experience imposed upon many food and retail companies during the lockdowns, to the virtual showrooms in the manufacturing industry, allowing clients to browse and choose the products they like best, most business-to-consumer companies rapidly understood the need to offer their clients a beginning-to-end digital journey. As some lockdowns came to an end and certain economies crept back to life, similar opportunities emerged in business-to-business applications, particularly in manufacturing, where physical distancing rules had to be put into place at short notice, often in challenging environments, for example, on assembly lines. As a direct result, the Internet of Things made impressive inroads. Some companies that had been slow in the recent pre-lockdown past to adopt IoT are now embracing it en masse with the specific objective of doing as many things as possible remotely. Equipment maintenance, management inventory, supplier relations, or safety strategies. All of these different activities can now be performed to a large extent via a computer. IoT offers companies not only the means to execute and uphold social distance rules, but also to reduce costs and implement more agile operations. During the peak of the pandemic, O2O, online to offline, gained major traction, highlighting the importance of having both an online and offline presence and opening the door or even the floodgates to eversion. This phenomenon of blurring the distinction between online and offline is identified by the famous science fiction writer William Gibson, who stated, "Our world is a vertic, with the cyberspace relentlessly opening out, has emerged as one of the most potent trends of the post-COVID-19 era." The pandemic crisis accelerated this phenomenon of eversion because it both forced and encouraged us towards a digital, weightless world faster than ever, as more and more economic activity had no choice but to take place digitally. Education, consulting, publishing, and many others. We could go as far as to say that, for a little while, teleportation supplanted transportation. Most executive committee meetings, board meetings, team meetings, brainstorm exercises, and other forms of personal or social interaction had to take place remotely. This new reality is captured in the market capitalization of Zoom, the video conferencing company that skyrocketed to $70 billion in June 2020, higher at that time than that of any US airline. Concurrently, large online companies like Amazon and Alibaba expanded decisively in the O2O business, particularly in food retailing and logistics. Trends like telemedicine or remote working that expanded extensively during the confinement are unlikely to retreat. For them, there will be no return to the status quo that prevailed prior to the pandemic. Telemedicine, in particular, will benefit considerably. For obvious reasons, healthcare is one of the most heavily regulated industries in the world, a fact that inevitably slows the pace of innovation. But the necessity to address the pandemic with any means available, plus during the outbreak, the need to protect health workers by allowing them to work remotely, removed some of the regulatory and legislative impediments related to the adoption of telemedicine. In the future, it is certain that more medical care will be delivered remotely. It will in turn accelerate the trend towards more wearable and at-home diagnostics, like smart toilets capable of tracking health data and performing health analyses. What? This man just unprovoked bring up freaking smart toilets? I'm sorry? Uh, Smart toilets. Is that where we're going? God help us. Amen. Equally, the pandemic may prove to be a boon for online education. In Asia, the shift to online education has been particularly notable, with a sharp increase in students' digital enrollments much higher valuation for online education businesses, and more capital available for edtech startups. The flip side of this particular coin will be an increase in pressure on institutions offering more traditional methods of education to validate their worth and justify their fees, as we expand upon a little later. The speed of expansion has been nothing short of breathtaking. In Britain, less than 1% of initial medical consultations took place via video link in 2019. Under lockdown, 100% are occurring remotely. In another example, a leading US retailer in 2019 wanted to launch a curbside delivery business. Its plan envisaged taking 18 months. During the lockdown, it went live in less than a week, allowing it to serve its customers while maintaining the livelihoods of its workforce. Online banking interactions have risen to 90% during the crisis, from 10%, with no drop off in quality and an increase in compliance, while providing a customer experience that isn't just about online banking. Similar examples abound. The social mitigation response to the pandemic and the physical distancing measures imposed during the confinement will also result in e-commerce emerging as an ever more powerful industry trend. Consumers need products, and if they can't shop, they will inevitably resort to purchasing them online. As the habit kicks in, people who had never shopped online before will become comfortable with doing so, while people who were part-time online shoppers before will presumably rely on it more. This was made evident during the lockdowns. In the US, Amazon and Walmart hired a combined 250,000 workers to keep up with the increase in demand and built massive infrastructure to deliver online. This accelerating growth of e-commerce means that the giants of the online retail industry are likely to emerge from the crisis even stronger than they were in the pre-pandemic era. There are always two sides to a story. As the habit of shopping online becomes more prevalent, it will depress brick and mortar, high street, and mall retail still further. Phenomenon explored in more detail in the next sections. Now, I feel like this should really go without saying, but I do consider this quite a dystopian scenario. More of our lives are being consumed by screens, like the one you're watching this on right now. We are socializing less. We are, to some extent, shopping less. And granted, I'm not like some near Luddite who wants to abolish the internet. I wouldn't go that far. But the way that the internet has been so the way the internet has consumed us and atomized society even more than it already was, it's like we wonder why depression and anxiety and things are rising so much. Because there is no, because, like, even in the words of Margaret Thatcher, there is no society anymore. There is no society. There is just a bunch of individuals alone, isolated from one another, completely atomized from one another. This is the logic of neoliberalism. There is no collective. There's only the individual. That is neoliberalism. And it has absolutely fucked us. It has absolutely fucked us. Like, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Do I think that this isn't reversible? No. I do think it is reversible. It just takes a little bit of effort. And I think this, like, the process of doing so will be easier for some countries and in some areas than it will be in others. For example, in the global south, I can see it being a lot easier because they don't really have that much internet infrastructure. In the first world, I think it's going to be largely a decisive urban-rural divide, which is why a lot of the things that I have been thinking about have been focused on rural areas, but also possibly on diluting cities by incentivizing people to move to rural areas. Because at the end of the day, big urban centers with populations in the millions, you don't build you don't build a very good, like, social society like that when you have massive skyscrapers. Like, when you have massive skyscrapers and everyone's just driving a car everywhere. No one, and and not to mention the working week, and especially how that's had to basically artificially increase in order for people to even make a living. We are in a time, like, the cities should be abolished, in my opinion, outright abolished. This has been this has been a fairly recent change that I've started feeling a little bit more strongly about this. Cities should be abolished because cities are, like, modern cities are by their nature alienating. They alienate us from each other. They alienate us from our labor in a capitalist society. They alienate us from nature to a significant degree. There is really, in a socialist society, there is nothing to gain from keeping cities. And there is nothing to lose in their abolition. Because rural towns, especially smaller rural towns, very tight knit. Very tight knit. And you can make that even more tight knit with the right kind of social infrastructure and institutions in place to foster that tight knittedness. Which is why I have been focusing so much on the rural area and why I have shifted quite drastically towards a communalist praxis. Because that is how you resolve a lot of the problems of society, of that capitalist society, especially in its neoliberal stage, has produced. So, I mean, we can look at this and hear all this. It is quite dystopian from the perspective of, like, it is just quite dystopian. I'm gonna be honest. Which is why, like, I used to be like a hardcore productivist. I mean, to a degree, I still am to an extent. Like, I do think the forces of production should be built over time. Uh, and I think future generations in like a proper sort of communist society might like disagree, might start building cities going to space. Which, I mean, the idea of going to space is still appealing. Right, don't get me wrong about that one. But like I used to be quite like I've pretty much started to go in the complete opposite direction to the way I used to go with this. I used to be like, oh, we need to turn all the towns into cities. Now I'm like, no, we need to get rid of the cities and build more towns. Literally gone in the opposite direction. It's actually kind of funny. um, so yeah, maybe I should maybe I should read Half Earth Socialism on the Strings at some point because that was yeah that it tends to be considered a kind of eco-socialist manifesto, even if it comes at it from like a utopian angle. Um, but yeah, there is there's a lot to go through. But let's continue this. 2.1.2 Resilient Supply Chains. The very nature of global supply chains and their innate fragility means that arguments about shortening them have been brewing for years. They tend to be intricate and complex to manage. They are also difficult to monitor in terms of compliance with environmental standards and labor laws, potentially exposing companies to reputation risk and damage to their brands. In light of this troubled past, the pandemic has placed the last nail in the coffin of the principle that companies should optimize supply chains based on individual component costs and depending on a single supply source for critical mineral materials, summed up as favoring efficiency over resilience. In the post-pandemic era, it is end-to-end value optimization, an idea that includes both resilience and efficiency alongside cost that will prevail. It is epitomized in the formula that just in case will eventually replace just in time. The shocks to global supply chains analyzed in the macro section will affect global businesses and smaller companies alike. But what does just in case mean in practice? The model of globalization developed at the end of the last century, conceived and constructed by global manufacturing companies that were on the prowl for cheap labor, products, and components, has found its limits. It fragmented international production into ever more intricate bits and pieces and resulted in a system run on a just in time basis that is proven to be extremely lean and efficient, but also exceedingly complex, and as such, very vulnerable. Complexity brings fragility and often results in instability. Simplification is therefore the antidote, which should in turn generate more resilience. This means that the global value chains that represent roughly 3/4 of all global trade will inevitably decline. This decline will be compounded by the new reality that companies dependent upon complex just-in-time supply chains can no longer take it for granted that tariff commitments enshrined by the World Trade Organization will protect them from a sudden surge in protectionism somewhere. As a result, they will be forced to prepare accordingly by reducing or localizing their supply chain and elaborating alternative production or procurement plans to guard against a prolonged disruption. Every business whose profitability is contingent upon the principle of just-in-time global supply chain will have to rethink how it operates and probably sacrifice the idea of maximizing efficiency and profits for the sake of supply security and resilience. Resilience will therefore become the primary consideration for any business serious about hedging against disruption, be it disruption to a particular supplier, to a possible change in trade policy, or to a particular country or region. In practice, this will force companies to diversify their supplier base, even at the cost of holding inventories and building in redundancy. It will also compel these companies to ensure that the same is true within their own supply chain. They will assess resilience along their entire supply chain, all the way down to their ultimate supplier and possibly even the suppliers of their suppliers. The costs of production will inevitably rise, but this will be the price to pay for building resilience. At first glance, the industries that will be the most affected because they will be the first to shift production patterns are automotive, electronics, and industrial machinery. Again, I would interject on this and say there are ways around this in terms of like costs of production and like a concrete solution within the capitalist system, within the capitalist framework, which like I mean at the very minimum, like the real thing that you can do to like to not have to worry all that much about the cost of production. I mean, there's a whole suite of things. But worker cooperatives, worker cooperatives resolve the antagonism between capital and labor. Worker cooperatives, you democratize the businesses. The workers share in the fruits of production. And I mean, sure, and you could probably fuse that with some kind of democratic planned economy. I think that's kind of what the model of venture communism kind of boils down to. Because at the end of the day, if you have like a venture commune that encompasses a bunch of different worker cooperatives in like a ton of different industries, what can that open the door to? Considering that all the members of the worker cooperatives are also members of the venture commune, what does that open the door to? Planning, democratic planning, coordination between all the different cooperatives in order to like make the supply chain more efficient, but also in this case more resilient, especially if they're kind of all supplying each other a little bit and they're doing it according to a plan rather than the market. So, and what do you get with this? Like if you expand this like to an entire national economy or world economy, what do you get? You basically get a kind of I mean, really, you really get some kind of central, like, it's centralized, but democratic market anarchism? Like market anarchism, but centralized? I feel like that would nearly be what that would look like if you would expand the venture commune model to like an entire country or like the entire world. You would basically just get market anarchism, but it's kind of centralized. So, I mean, unless the cooperatives were able to pull out, if the worker cooperatives were able to pull out, I feel like that would literally just be market anarchism. Except they would be planning because they're part of this cooperative, so they can just coordinate shit with each other. That is actually a very interesting thing. I do intend to read the Telecommunist Manifesto at some point, which is like a sort of manifesto that lays out that model. Um, but yeah, like I mean, there are ways to solve this. Like the cost of production will inevitably rise, and it's like how do you drop the like in first world countries reshoring industry, for instance, like Australia. If we reshored industry using a traditional business model with our current labor laws, the costs of production and hence the cost of products would rise significantly. How do you bring those costs back down? The only real way to do it is to lower the wages. But with a worker clause, there are potentially loopholes which rely on subsistence being provided in a non-marketized, needs-based fashion, which is a conversation for another day. So, but yeah. So, 2.1.3 Governments and Business. For all the reasons expanded upon in the first chapter, COVID-19 has rewritten many of the rules of the game between the public and private sectors. In the post-pandemic era, business will be subject to much greater government interference than in the past. The benevolent or otherwise greater intrusion of governments in the life of companies and the conduct of their business will be country and industry dependent, therefore taking many different guises. Outlined below are three notable forms of impact that will emerge with force in the early months of the post-pandemic period: conditional bailouts, public procurement, and labour market regulations. Here we get to communism, everyone. Fucking joke. I swear to God, I get pissed off whenever I see libertarians calling any kind of state intervention in the economy communist. It's like, no, that's not what communism is. It drives me out the fucking wall every time I hear it. Every fucking time it drives me up the wall. I'm like, it's like government, like communism is not when the government, or socialism is not when the government does stuff. It's a completely separate kind of society built on completely different relations of production. it's it's a joke, but you know. Continue. For a start, all the stimulus packages being put together in Western economies to support ailing industries and individual companies will have covenants constraining, in particular, the borrower's ability to fire employees, buy back shares, and pay executive bonuses. In the same vein, governments, encouraged, supported, and sometimes pushed by activists and public sentiments, will target suspiciously low corporate tax bills and generously high executive rewards. They will show little patience for senior executives and investors who push companies to spend more on buybacks, minimize their tax payments, and pay huge dividends. US airlines, pilloried for seeking government assistance, having recently and consistently used large amounts of company cash to pay shareholder dividends, are a prime example of how this change in public attitude will be enacted by governments. In addition, in the coming months and years, a regime change might occur when policymakers take on a substantial portion of private sector default risk. When this happens, governments will want something in return. Germany's bailout of Lufthansa epitomizes this sort of situation. The government injected liquidity into the national carrier, but only on the condition that the company constrains executive pay, including stock options, and commits to not paying dividends. Better alignment between public policy and corporate planning will be a particular focus of attention in terms of greater government interference. The scramble for ventilators during the peak of the pandemic epitomizes why. In 2010 in the US, 40,000 ventilators had been ordered through a government contract but were never delivered, largely explaining the country's shortage that became so apparent in March 2020. What led to this situation of scarcity? In 2012, the original company that had won the bid was bought in somewhat dubious and obscure circumstances by a much larger manufacturer, a publicly traded company also producing ventilators. It later emerged that the purchasing company wanted to prevent the original bidder from building a cheaper ventilator that would have undermined the profitability of its own business. This company dragged its feet before eventually cancelling the contract and ultimately being acquired by a rival. None of the 40,000 ventilators were ever delivered to the US government. It is unlikely that this sort of situation will reoccur in the post-pandemic era, as public authorities will think twice about outsourcing projects that have critical public health implications, or indeed critical public implications, security or otherwise, to private companies. The bottom line, the maximization of profit and the short-termism that often goes with it is rarely, or at least not always, consistent with the public goal of preparing for a future crisis. Around the world, the pressure to improve the social protection and salary level of low-paid employees will increase. Most likely, in our post-pandemic world, increases in the minimum wage will become a central issue that will be addressed via the greater regulation of minimum standards and a more thorough enforcement of the rules that already exist. Most notably, companies will have to pay higher taxes and various forms of government funding, like services for social care. The gig economy will feel the impact of such a policy more than any other sector. Prior to the pandemic, it was already in the crosshairs of government scrutiny. In the post-pandemic era, for reasons related to the redefinition of the social contract, this scrutiny will intensify. Companies that rely on gig workers to operate will also feel the effect of more government interference, possibly even to a degree capable of undermining their financial viability. As the pandemic will radically alter social and political attitudes towards gig workers, governments will force those companies that employ them to offer proper contracts with benefits such as social insurance and health coverage. The labour issue will loom large for them, and if they have to employ gig workers as normal employees, they will cease to be profitable. Their raison d'etre might even vanish. So, the gig economy has certainly become increasingly at the center of like talk within like the socialist movement as well, whether that be Marxists or anarchists. And I think it's been summed up pretty well in basically the creation of a new class, which has been referred to as the precariat, which in a sense is a little bit distinct to the petty bourgeoisie. And that's in the sense that the precariat is reliant on working for a company or for a larger company, but is formally considered an independent contractor and so doesn't get any of the guarantees of normal employees. Whereas the petty bourgeoisie, they kind of usually own their own means of production, which I mean, technically, like like a gig worker does as well. Like if you count their car as a means of production, which I wouldn't, but I suppose it would in this instance. Um, it's just one of those things. But like this has come to the center of all the talk about, and I think it also, I think the precariat might also include casual workers. I would have to get back to that, and I do want to read about this at some stage. Maybe not on the streams, but maybe elsewhere. Like I'll put an article on my Substack or something. Um, but yeah, that is, it's a pretty crucial discussion nowadays. Here we go. 2.1.4 Stakeholder Capitalism and ESG. Over the past 10 years or so, the fundamental changes that have taken place in each of the five macro categories reviewed in Chapter 1 have profoundly altered the environment in which companies operate. They have made stakeholder capitalism and environmental, social, and governance considerations, or ESG, increasingly relevant to sustainable value creation. ESG can be considered as the yardstick for stakeholder capitalism. The pandemic struck at a time when many different issues, ranging from climate change activism and rising inequalities to gender diversity and Me Too scandals, had already begun to raise awareness and heighten the criticality of stakeholder capitalism and ESG considerations in today's independent world. Whether espoused openly or not, nobody would now deny that companies' fundamental purpose can no longer simply be the unbridled pursuit of financial profit. It is now incumbent upon them to serve all their stakeholders, not only those who hold shares. This is corroborated by early anecdotal evidence, pointing to an even more positive outlook for ESG in the post pandemic era. This can be explained on three fronts. One, the crisis will have created or reinforced an acute sense of responsibility and urgency on most issues pertaining to ESG strategies, the most important being climate change. But others, such as consumer behavior, the future of work and mobility, and supply chain responsibility, will move to the forefront of the investment process and will become an integral component of due diligence. Two, the pandemic leaves no doubt in boardrooms that the absence of ESG considerations has the potential to destroy substantial value and even threaten the viability of a business. ESG will therefore become more fully integrated and internalized into the core strategy and governance of a company. It will also alter the way in which investors assess corporate governance. Tax records, dividend payments, and remunerations will become increasingly scrutinized for fear of incurring a reputational cost when a problem arises or is made public. 3. Fostering employee and community goodwill will be the key to enhancing a brand's reputation. More and more, companies will have to prove that they treat their workers well by welcoming improved labor practices and paying attention to health and safety as well as well-being in the workplace. Companies will not necessarily adhere to these measures because they are genuinely good, but rather because the price of not doing so will be too high in terms of the wrath of activists, both activist investors and social activists. The conviction that ESG strategies benefited from the pandemic and are most likely to benefit further is corroborated by various surveys and reports. Early data shows that the sustainability sector outperformed conventional funds during the first quarter of 2020. According to Morningstar, which compared first quarter returns for more than 200 sustainability equity funds and exchange traded funds, The sustainable funds performed better by 1 percentage point or two on a relative basis. A report from BlackRock offers further evidence that companies with strong ESG ratings outperformed their peers during the pandemic. Several analysts suggested that this outperformance might simply have reflected the reduced exposure to fossil fuels of ESG funds and strategies. But BlackRock asserts that ESG compliant companies, another way to say that they adhere to the principle of stakeholder capitalism, tend to be more resilient because of their holistic understanding of risk management. It seems that the more susceptible the world becomes to a broad set of macro risks and issues, the greater the necessity to embrace stakeholder capitalism and ESG strategies. The debate between those who believe that stakeholder capitalism will be sacrificed on the altar of the recovery and those who argue that it is now time to build back better is far from resolved. For every Michael O'Leary, the CEO of Ryanair, who thinks that COVID-19 will put ESG considerations on the back burner for a few years, there is a Brian Chesky, CEO of Airbnb, who is committed to transforming his business into a stakeholder company. However, irrespective of anybody's opinion about the merits of stakeholder capitalism and ESG strategies and their future role in the post-pandemic era, activism will make a difference by reinforcing the trend. Social activists and many activist investors will scrutinize closely how companies behave during the pandemic crisis. It is likely that the markets or the consumers or both will punish those companies that performed poorly on social issues. An essay co-written in April 2020 by Leo Strine, an influential judge in corporate America, hammers home this point about a necessary change in corporate governance. We are again paying the price for a corporate governance system that lacks focus on financial soundness, sustainable wealth creation, and the fair treatment of workers. For too long, the stock market's power over our economy has grown at the expense of other stakeholders, particularly workers. Although overall wealth has grown, it has done so in a skewed way that is unfair to the bulk of the American workers who are primarily responsible for that increase. This shift towards satisfying insatiable stock market demands has also led to increasing levels of corporate debt and economic risk. See, guys, this is communism. He's talking about workers being responsible for an increase in wealth. He's talking about making sure workers get their fair share. That's communism. No, it's not. No, it's not. No, it's not. Oh. For activists, the decency exhibited, or not, by companies during the crisis will be paramount. Businesses will be judged for years to come by their actions, critically not just in a narrow commercial sense, but viewed through a broader social lens. You will forget, for example, that over the past 10 years, US airlines spent 96% of their cash flow on share buybacks, and that in March 2020, EasyJet paid a £174 million dividend payout to its shareholders, including £60 million to its founder. The activism to which companies may now be subjected is going beyond the traditional confines of social activism by outsiders and investor activism. With employee activism, it is expanding internally. In May 2020, just as the epicenter of the pandemic was moving from the US to Latin America, Google employees, emboldened by a report published by Greenpeace, succeeded in convincing the company to no longer build custom AI and machine learning algorithms for upstream extraction in the oil and gas industry. Several such examples in the recent past illustrate rising employee activism, ranging from environmental issues to social and inclusivity concerns. They provide a telling example of how different types of activists are learning to work together to further the goals to achieve a more sustainable future. Concomitantly, a sharp increase has taken place in the oldest form of activism, industrial action. In the US in particular, while many white collar workers were riding out the pandemic while working from home, many low wage essential workers out in the trenches who had no choice but to go to work staged a wave of walkouts, strikes, and protests. As issues of worker safety, pay, and benefits become more central, the agenda of stakeholder capitalism will gain in relevance and strength. I can see why libertarians oppose this so much. It's not communism, but I can see what, like, reading this now, I can see why libertarians oppose this so much. This, it's enlightening. It's enlightening. I can see precisely why lib caps, libertarian capitalists, people who right libertarians, not left libertarians, libertarian socialists, not them. Because I'm technically one of them, and I oppose, well, I mean, okay, I mean, both sides oppose this, but for completely different reasons. I can see why right libertarians fucking hate this. Because it means giving workers a little bit more, you know, a little bit more of their value back. It means going back to basically New Deal type shit. Somewhat, at least. Although with more involvement from companies rather than so much involvement from the state. Um, but in a sense, it is kind of just going back to Keynesianism to an extent. But it's enlightening. I can see why right libertarians hate this so much. I can see why they just ramble on and go, oh, this is communism. It's not communism. It's just not. It's only communism or it's only socialism if you take this bastardized notion that socialism is when the government does stuff as gospel. Socialism is not just when the government does stuff. And you know what actually makes you know what actually makes this problem even worse? Like, what actually makes this problem even worse with respect to all this shit regarding like all the shit with respect to like socialism just being when the government does stuff. You want to know what makes stuff worse? When capitalist countries call themselves communist. Case in point, China today. Case in point, China today. Oh, ruled by a communist party, but a thoroughly capitalist economy. And maybe it's not a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie in the traditional sense of the term. I suppose that's a little bit different. I suppose it is a little bit different in some sense. I mean, I'll look into this a little bit more because I know Leon Trotsky made similar accusations about the Soviet Union, specifically Stalin, regarding Bonapartism or like Marx's notion of a Bonapartist state, which is like kind of like when the state elevates itself above society. So, I mean, I'd have to explore that later, but I have pondered whether that's what's going on with China, whether China is really just a Bonapartist state, or like a bureaucratic Bonapartist state in the same way that Trotsky accused Stalin of. So, although I guess in the case of, like, if it is true, it would be different for China and the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union, the bureaucracy basically controlled the means of production. Whereas, whereas in China, there is like a private sector. So that's sort of one thing to consider. I'm thinking whether I can finish this. Not the whole book, but chapter two. Because there isn't actually all that much. Yeah, why not? No, I will roll a cigarette. So that didn't take as long as I thought it would. So yeah, I'm just gonna finish all of chapter two, and then we can get on to the individual reset. In fact, I wonder. I could just finish the rest of. I could just finish chapter two this week, and then chapter three, and the rest of it next week. I might do that actually. That sounds like a good idea. Get this thing over and done with, and then we'll get on to imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Because that'll be one that I think will be important for people who haven't. Well, I mean, I haven't read it before, so it'll be good for me as well. It'll be good for me to go through it, especially right on the back of the Great Reset. Um, because in some sense, it is quite relevant, and probably even more relevant to today. Right after that, we'll be going right on the back of the Great Reset and imperialism, the high state of capitalism, with Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. That is one that will be very, very much relevant for today, and probably quite terrifying to read, if I'm being honest. It will probably be quite terrifying for me to read. And I think maybe as like some of you keep up with these streams and listen to it as well, you might find it equally terrifying. So something to something to consider. Um, but yeah, I think for a while it's going to kind of be basically going, back to back some pretty heavy hitter enlightenment. Yeah, some pretty enlightening texts. Um, as for what I might read after the age of surveillance capitalism, maybe half Earth socialism. Although I'm probably not going to think too far ahead because I may want to get to something else, uh, like perhaps perhaps Michael Hudson's Super Imperialism, the Strategy of American Empire. Uh, maybe digging into some more of the modicum of truth behind these conspiracy theories of the New World Order, which which a lot of it goes back to the Round Table, and like it's the reason why I have referred quite consistently nowadays to the Anglo-American Empire rather than simply the American Empire. Um, and that would be like some of the works of Carroll Quigley. So, so that would be quite an enlightening journey as well. But we'll see where that goes when I get that far. So, I think the streams will be a good opportunity to read some books that haven't been awfully high on my priority list, because I have been working on some projects behind the scenes. Uh, for example, my theological building project, Project Nitsa, which is theology. Uh, Along with just trying to make write articles, and currently writing an article on kind of like a review of Lenin's The State and Revolution. And that will probably be a point where I build up from there. Uh, so, I mean, look forward to some book reviews and articles and stuff on the Substack. Because they will come, and you'll kind of get to keep up a little bit with my own kind of learning journey as I go through all this stuff, especially the theological stuff. That stuff will be pretty significant in time, I think. So, so yes. All right, let's continue reading. 2.2 Industry Reset. As a result of the lockdowns, the pandemic had immediate effect on every possible industry around the world. This impact is ongoing and will continue to be felt in the coming years. As global supply chains are reconfigured, as consumer demands change, as governments intervene more, as market conditions evolve, and as technology disrupts, companies will be forced to continuously adapt and reinvent themselves. The purpose of this section is not to offer a precise account of how each particular industry might evolve, but rather to illustrate with impressionist brushstrokes how some of the main features and trends associated with the pandemic will impact specific industries. Two point 2.1 Social interaction and de-densification. Effects on travel and tourism, hospitality, entertainment, retail, aerospace, and even the automotive industry. The ways in which consumers interact with each other, as well as what and how they consume, have been significantly affected by the pandemic. Consequently, the ensuing reset in different industries will vary fundamentally depending on the nature of the economic transaction involved. In those industries where consumers transact socially and in person, the first months and possibly years of the post pandemic era will be much tougher than for those where the transaction can be at a greater physical distance or even virtual. In modern economies, a large amount of what we consume happens through social interaction. Travel and vacations, bars and restaurants, sporting events and retail, cinemas and theatres, concerts and festivals, conventions and conferences, museums and libraries, education, they all correspond to social forms of consumption that represent a significant portion of total economic activity and employment. Services represent about 80% of total jobs in the US, most of which are social by nature. So, yeah, this is sort of talking about like the service economy for the most part. They cannot take place in the virtual world, or when they can, only in a truncated and often suboptimal form, like a live orchestra performance on a screen. Industries that have social interaction at their core have been hit the hardest by the lockdowns. Among them are many sectors that are to a very significant portion of total economic activity and employment: travel and tourism, leisure, sport events, and entertainment. For months and possibly years, they will be forced to operate at reduced capacity, hit by the double whammy of fears about the virus restraining consumption and the imposition of regulations aimed at countering these fears by creating more physical space between consumers. Public pressure for physical distancing will endure until a vaccine is developed and commercialized at scale, which, again, according to most experts, is most unlikely to happen before the first or second quarter of 2021 at the earliest. In the intervening period, it is likely that people may travel much less for both vacation and or business. They may go less frequently to restaurants, cinemas, and theaters, and may decide that it is safer to buy online rather than physically go to the shops. For these fundamental reasons, the industries hit the hardest by the pandemic will also be the slowest to recover. Hotels, restaurants, airlines, shops, and cultural venues in particular will be forced to make expensive alterations in the way they deliver their offerings in order to adapt to a post pandemic new normal that will demand the implementation of drastic changes involving introducing extra space, regular cleaning, protections for staff, and technology that limits customers' interactions with workers. In many of these industries, but particularly in hospitality and retail, small businesses will suffer disproportionately, having to walk a very fine line between surviving the closures imposed by the lockdowns or sharply reduced business and bankruptcy. Operating at reduced capacity with even tighter margins means that many will not survive. And we've seen this in practice. The fallout from their failure will have hard felt ramifications both for national economies and local communities. Small businesses are the main engine of employment growth and account in most advanced economies for half of all private sector jobs. If significant numbers of them go to the wall, if there are fewer shops, restaurants, and bars in a particular neighborhood, the whole community will be impacted as unemployment rises and demand dries up, setting in motion a vicious and downward spiral and affecting ever greater numbers of small businesses in a particular community. The ripples will eventually spread beyond the confines of the local community, affecting, albeit hopefully to a lesser extent, other more distant areas. The highly interdependent and interconnected nature of today's economy, industries, and businesses, comparable to the dynamic linking the macro categories, means that each has a rapid knock on effect on the others in a myriad of different manners. Take restaurants. This sector of activity has been hit by the pandemic to such a dramatic extent that it is not even sure how the restaurant business will ever come back. As one restaurateur put it, I, like hundreds of other chefs across the city and thousands around the country, am now staring down the question of what our restaurants, our careers, our lives might look like if we can even get them back. In France and the UK, several industry voices estimate that up to 75% of independent restaurants might not survive the lockdowns and subsequent social distancing measures. The large chains and fast food giants will. This, in turn, suggests that big businesses will get bigger, while the smallest shrink or disappear. A large restaurant chain, for example, has a better chance of staying operational as it benefits from more resources and ultimately less competition in the wake of bankruptcies among smaller outfits. The small restaurants that survive the crisis will have to reinvent themselves entirely. In the meantime, in the cases of those that close their doors forever, the closure will impact not only the restaurant and its immediate staff, but also all the businesses that operate in its orbit, the suppliers, the farmers, and the truck drivers. Ooh, I might drop smoke on the book. and that and I think this is going to be another long lasting effect of this kind of social isolation that neoliberal economics has kind of dawned on us. It's it's not positive. And you know, at the end of the day, small business being proletarianized, it's from a strictly like kind of vulgar Marxist perspective, it's a good thing because it means the proletariat is bigger. It means there's less petty bourgeoisie to fall prey to fascists or something like that. But the task of communalist praxis, like that which I am attempting to do in my area, is to replace all that with something else, with something better, with something that's more needs based. Imagine these chefs going out of business. Imagine their if their uh, if their expertise could be better used to cook meals that can be distributed to people in communities using crops that have been locally grown on a grassroots level, not by farmers selling it but homesteading. For crops that have been grown via homesteading. Homesteading has been a particular emphasis on my part recently. I have inserted myself into a crop sharing circle, and a responsibility which I have imposed on myself in the process of this praxis is to get as many people involved in that as possible to try and massively expand that. More crop sharing. And that will reduce cost of living. That can reduce the cost of living. And not only that, can bring people together and can essentially decommodify food. That is the logical conclusion of this. The decommodification of agriculture and food. And that's, like, if that can be decommodified and converted into a fully needs-based thing, just on a grassroots level, no government intervention needed, that is a pretty big deal. And, obviously, like, doing that fully is probably a little bit of a pipe dream. But the further we can get, the better it will be. But yeah. At the other end of the size spectrum, some very large companies will fall victim to the same predicament as the very small ones. Airline companies, in particular, will face similar constraints in terms of consumer demand and social distancing rules. The 3-month shutdown has left carriers around the world with a cataclysmic situation of virtually zero revenues and the prospect of tens of thousands of job cuts. British Airways, for one, has announced that it will cut up to 30% of its current workforce of 42,000 employees. At the time of writing, mid-June 2020, the restart may be just about to begin. It will prove extremely challenging, with the recovery expected to take years. The improvement will begin in leisure travel, with corporate travel to follow. However, as discussed in the next section, consumption habits may change permanently. If many businesses decide to travel less to reduce costs and to replace physical meetings by virtual ones whenever possible, the impact on the recovery and ultimate profitability of airlines may be dramatic and lasting. Prior to the pandemic, corporate travel accounted for 30% of airline volumes, but 50% of revenues, thanks to higher priced seats and last minute bookings. In the future, this is set to change, making the profitability outcome of some individual airlines highly uncertain and forcing the entire industry to reconsider the long-term structure of the global aviation market. When assessing the ultimate effect on a particular industry, the complete chain of consequences needs to take into account what happens in adjacent industries, whose fate largely depends on what happens in the one upstream or at the top. To illustrate this, we take a brief look at 3 industries that entirely depend on the aviation sector: airports, infrastructure and retail, planes, aerospace, and car rentals, automotive. Airports face the same challenges as airlines. The less people fly, the less they transit via airports. This in turn affects the level of consumption in the various shops and restaurants that make up the ecosystem of all international airports throughout the world. Furthermore, the experience of airports in a post-COVID-19 world involving longer waiting times, highly restricted or even no hand luggage, and other potentially inconvenient social distancing measures, could erode the consumer desire to travel by air for pleasure and leisure. Various trade associations warn that the implementation of social distancing policies would not only limit airport capacity by 20 to 40%, but would also likely render the whole experience so disagreeable as to become a deterrent. Dramatically affected by the lockdowns, airlines began to cancel or defer orders for new aircraft and to change their choice of particular model. In so doing, severely impacting the aerospace industry. As a direct consequence, and for the foreseeable future, the major civil aircraft assembly plants will operate at reduced capacity with cascading effects on the entirety of their value chain and supplier network. In the longer term, changes in demand by airline companies that reevaluate their needs will lead to a complete reassessment of the production of civilian aircraft. This makes the defense aerospace sector an exception and relatively safe haven. For nation states, the uncertain geopolitical outlook makes it imperative to maintain orders and procurement, but cash-constrained governments will demand better payment terms. Like airports, car rental companies depend almost entirely on aviation volumes. Hertz, a highly indebted company with a fleet of 700,000 cars overwhelmingly idled during the lockdowns, filed for bankruptcy in May. Like for so many companies, COVID-19 proved to be the proverbial last straw. Two point two point two behavioral changes. Permanent versus transient. Effects on retail, real estate, and education. Some behavioral changes observed during the lockdowns are unlikely to be entirely reversed in the post-pandemic era, and some may even become permanent. How exactly this will play out remains very uncertain. A few consumption patterns may revert to long-term trend lines comparable to air travel after 9/11, albeit at an altered pace. Others will undoubtedly accelerate, like online services. Some may be postponed, like buying a car, while new permanent patterns of consumption may emerge, like purchases associated with greener mobility. Much of this is still unknown. During the lockdowns, a lot of consumers were forced to learn to do things for themselves, bake their bread, cook from scratch, cut their own hair, etc., and felt the need to spend cautiously. How entrenched will these new habits and forms of do it yourself and auto consumption become in the post pandemic era? Hopefully, very entrenched, but I don't know. The same could apply to students who, in some countries, pay exorbitant fees for higher education. After a trimester spent watching their professors on their screens, will they start questioning the high cost of education? To grasp the extreme complexity and uncertainty of this evolution in consumer behavior, let us revert to the example of online shopping versus in-person retail. As stated, it is very likely that brick and mortar stores will lose out severely in favor of online shopping. Consumers may be willing to pay a bit extra to have heavy and bulky products like bottles and household goods delivered to them. Supermarket retail space will therefore shrink, coming to resemble convenience stores where shoppers go to buy relatively small quantities of specific food products. But it could also be the case that less money will be spent in restaurants, suggesting that in places where a high percentage of people's food budget traditionally went to restaurants, 60% in New York City, for example. These funds could be diverted to and benefit urban supermarkets as city dwellers rediscover the pleasure of cooking at home. The same phenomenon may happen with the entertainment business. The pandemic may increase our anxiety about sitting in an enclosed space with complete strangers, and many people may decide that staying home to watch the latest movie or opera is the wisest option. Such a decision will benefit local supermarkets to the detriment of bars and restaurants, although the option of online takeout meal delivery services could be a lifeline for the latter. There were numerous examples of this happening in an ad hoc fashion in cities across the world during lockdowns. I should note that even in the case of bars at times, or maybe not so much bars, but like pubs where there's food as well, like they were doing online delivery as well, which I suppose that counts as a restaurant. Bars specifically, I mean, I know like liquor stores have started doing like sort of food delivery via like, Uber Eats and all that kind of stuff, which, you know, again, gig economy, but yeah. Could it perhaps become an important element of some restaurants' new post COVID-19 business survival plan? There are other first round effects that are much easier to anticipate. Cleanliness is one of them. The pandemic will certainly heighten our focus on hygiene. A new obsession with cleanliness will particularly entail the creation of new forms of packaging. We will be encouraged not to touch the products we buy. Simple pleasures like smelling a melon or squeezing a fruit will be frowned upon and may even become a thing of the past, unless you grow it yourself. A single attitudinal change will have many different ramifications, each having a particular effect on one specific industry, but in the end impacting many different industries through ripple effects. The following figure illustrates this point for just one change: spending more time at home. Yeah, that's impossible to see. Um, it's just kind of like a thing. Uh, there isn't all that much I can do to put this up on the screen. Sorry. The heated debate over whether or to what extent we will work remotely in the future, and as a result spend more time at home, has been taking place since the pandemic started. Some analysts argue that the fundamental appeal of cities, particularly the largest ones, as vibrant centers of economic activity, social life, and creativity, will endure. Others fear that the coronavirus has triggered a fundamental shift in attitudes. They claim that COVID-19 has been an inflection point and predict that, all around the world, urbanites of all ages who are confronted with the shortcomings of city pollution and undersized, overpriced accommodation will decide to move to places with more greenery, more space, less pollution, and lower prices. Yes, please. It is too early to tell which camp will be proven right, but it is certain that even a relatively small percentage of people moving away from the biggest hubs, like New York, Hong Kong SAR, London, or Singapore, would exercise an outsized effect on many diverse industries. Profits are always made at the margin. Nowhere is this reality more apparent than in the real estate industry, and in particular in commercial real estate. The commercial real estate industry is an essential driver of global growth. Its total market value exceeds that of all stocks and bonds combined globally. Prior to the pandemic crisis, it was already suffering from an excess of supply. If the emergency practice of working remotely becomes an established and widespread habit, it is hard to imagine what companies, if any, will absorb this oversupply by rushing to lease excess office space. Perhaps there will be few investment funds ready to do so, but they will be the exception, suggesting that commercial real estate still has much further to fall. The pandemic will do to commercial real estate what it has done to so many other issues, both macro and micro. It will accelerate and amplify the pre-existing trend. The combination of an increase in the number of zombie companies, those that use debt to finance more debt, and that have not generated enough cash over the past few years to cover their interest costs, going bankrupt, and an increase in the number of people working remotely means that there will be far fewer tenants to rent empty office buildings. Property developers, for the most part highly leveraged themselves, will then start experiencing a wave of bankruptcies, with the largest and systemically important ones having to be bailed out by their respective governments. In many prime cities around the world, property prices will therefore fall over a long period of time, puncturing the global real estate bubble that had been years in the making. That hasn't happened. I don't think that's happened. At least in Australia, it hasn't. It's kept going up. To some extent, the same logic applies to residential real estate in large cities. If the trend of working remotely takes off, the combination of commuting not being a consideration any longer and the absence of job growth means that the younger generation will no longer choose to afford residential renting or buying in expensive cities. Inevitably, prices will then fall. In addition, many will have realized that working from home is more climate friendly and less stressful than having to commute to an office. The possibility of working remotely means that the biggest hubs that have benefited from higher economic growth than other cities or regions in their vicinity may start losing workers to the next tier of rising cities. This phenomenon could in turn create a wave of rising star cities or regions, attracting people looking for a better quality of life thanks to more space at more affordable prices. Notwithstanding all the above, perhaps the notion of widespread remote working becoming the norm is too far-fetched to happen in any meaningful manner. Haven't we so often heard that optimizing knowledge work, in reality the simplest sector to go remote, depends on carefully designed office environments? The technology industry that has resisted such a move for so long by massively investing in sophisticated campuses is now changing its mind in light of the lockdown experience. Twitter was the first company to commit to remote work. In May, Jack Dorsey, its CEO, former CEO, informed employees that many of them would be allowed to work from home even after the COVID-19 pandemic subsides. In other words, permanently. Other tech companies like Google and Facebook have also committed to allowing their staff to continue working remotely at least through the end of 2020. Anecdotal evidence suggests that other global firms from various industries will make similar decisions, letting part of their staff work remotely part of the time. The pandemic has made possible something that seemed unimaginable on such a scale just a few months ago. Could something similar and equally disruptive happen with higher education? Might it be possible to imagine a world in which far fewer students will receive their education on a campus? In May or June of 2020, In the midst of the lockdowns, students were forced to study and graduate remotely, many wondering at the end of the term if they will physically return to their campus in September. At the same time, universities started to slash their budgets, pondering what this unprecedented situation might entail for their business model. Should they go online or should they not? In the pre pandemic era, most universities offered some courses online, but always refrained from fully embracing online education. The most renowned universities refused to offer virtual degrees, fearful that this might dilute their exclusive offering, make some of their faculty redundant, and even threaten the very existence of the physical campus. In the post pandemic era, this will change. Most universities, particularly the expensive ones in the Anglo Saxon world, will have to alter their business model or go bankrupt because COVID-19 has made it obsolete. If online teaching were to continue in September and possibly beyond, many students would not tolerate paying the same high tuition for virtual education, demanding a reduction in fees or deferring their enrollment. In addition, many potential students would question the pertinence of disbursing prohibitive costs for higher education in a world marred by high levels of unemployment. A potential solution could lie in a hybrid model. Universities would then massively expand online education while maintaining an on campus presence for a different population of students. In a few instances, this has already been done with success, notably at Georgia Tech for an online master's degree in computer science. By going down this hybrid route, universities would expand access while reducing costs. The question, though, is whether this hybrid model is scalable and reproducible for universities that do not have the resources to invest in technology and in an exclusive library of top-notch content. But the hybrid character of online education can also take a different form by combining in-person and online study within one curriculum through online chats and the use of apps for tutoring and other forms of support and help. This has the advantage of streamlining the learning experience, but the disadvantage of erasing a large aspect of social life and personal interaction on a campus. Yep. In the summer of 2020, the direction of the trend seems clear. The world of education, like for so many other industries, will become partly virtual. 2.2.3 Resilience. Effects on big tech, health and well-being, banking and insurance, the automotive industry, electricity. During the pandemic, the quality of resilience, or the ability to thrive in difficult circumstances, gained must-have appeal and became the go-to buzzword everywhere. Understandably. For those fortunate enough to find themselves in industries naturally resilient to the pandemic, the crisis was not only more bearable, but even a source of profitable opportunities at a time of distress for the majority. Three industries in particular will flourish in aggregate in the post pandemic era: big tech, health, and wellness. In other industries that have been hit hard by the crisis, proving resilient is what will make the difference between bouncing back from the COVID-19 sudden exogenous shock or falling victim to it. The banking, insurance, and automotive sectors are three different examples of industries that have to build greater resilience, pass through the deep and prolonged recession caused by the health crisis. By and large, big tech was the resilient industry par excellence, for it emerged from this period of radical change as the biggest beneficiary. During the pandemic, as companies and their customers alike were forced to go digital, accelerate online plans, take up new networking tools, and start working from home, tech became an absolute necessity even among traditionally reluctant customers. For this reason, the combined market value of the leading tech companies hit record after record during the lockdowns, even rising back above levels before the outbreak started. For reasons expanded upon elsewhere in this book, this phenomenon is unlikely to abate anytime soon, quite the opposite. And this is just going to exacerbate the problem of finance, of surveillance capitalism. We'll get to that book. It'll be a doozy. Resilience, like all good practice, begins at home with us. So we can fairly assume that, in the post-pandemic era, we will become collectively more aware of the importance of our own physical and mental resilience. The desire, driven by greater necessity, to feel physically and mentally well, and the need to strengthen our immune system, mean that well-being and those sectors of the wellness industry positioned to help deliver them will emerge as strong winners. Also, the role of public health will evolve and expand. Well-being has to be addressed holistically. We cannot be individually well in a world that is unwell. Therefore, planetary care will be as important as personal care, an equivalence that strongly supports the promotion of principles we previously discussed, like stakeholder capitalism, the circular economy, and ESG strategies. At the company level, where the health effects of environmental degradation are increasingly clear, issues like air pollution, water management, and respect for biodiversity will become paramount. Being clean will be an industry imperative as well as an imperious necessity imposed by the consumer. Like for any other industry, digital will play a significant role in shaping the future of wellness. The combination of AI, the IoT, and sensors and wearable technology will produce new insights into personal well-being. They will monitor how we are and feel and will progressively blur the boundaries between public healthcare systems and personalized health creation systems, a distinction that will eventually break down. More surveillance. They're gonna get access to our health data. That's the thing here. That, like, as people lean into this, realize that you are giving your health data to big tech companies to be used for fucking ad revenue, to be used to sell you ads, to sell you shit. All of that data ends up feeding into their advertising algorithms so that other companies can market you shit. Like, you know, get to the book. I will leave it until then. I'll leave it until then to horrify everyone who watches, and possibly myself, with just how bad it probably. Well, when was this book? When was this book actually published? 2019, right before the pandemic. No doubt has it heavily expanded since then. Increasingly so. So when I read this, know that it has most, like 100%, gotten worse. Like, you want to be terrified when I read this, go through it knowing that it's gotten worse. 100%. Because of the pandemic, because of this. Streams of data in many separate domains ranging from our environments to our personal conditions will give us much greater control over our own health and well-being. In the post-COVID-19 world, precise information on our carbon footprints, our impact on biodiversity, on the toxicity of all the ingredients we consume, and the environments or spatial contexts in which we evolve, will generate significant progress in terms of our awareness of collective and individual well-being. Industries will have to take note. And this is going to be one of those things where, like, there is a way around this. There is a way to have all this sort of decentralized, health technology without the data extraction. That's the thing. It's the data extraction from the big tech companies. That's the real issue here. It's the fact that it's all being extracted for advertising algorithms. And, there are ways around this. We can do all of this with, consider open source. Consider like open source software and even perhaps open source hardware that is privacy and security focused, keeps the data on device, or there are countless probably more expensive ways of doing this that would involve like having your own server via like a network attached storage or something. Obviously, that's pretty expensive, but there are ways. There are always ways to increase your privacy, increase your security. Like in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be buying a Google Pixel phone. Oh, and you might ask, why would you be buying a Google Pixel phone when you've just been talking about privacy and security? Because I'm going to flash Graphene OS onto it. That's why. De-Google it. Immediately. Can't do that with other phones. And I think that needs to be a consideration when, for example, in Australia, I talk about the possible horizon of worker cooperatives allowing domestic smartphone production. Imagine having like smartphones that are privacy and security built out of the box with like a privacy and security focused kernel of Android. Something similar to Graphene OS. Or imagine some kind of similar architecture, like similar hardware to what exists in Google Pixel phones, and like a version of Graphene OS that's just built for that. Think of the demand for that. That's a crucial thing here, especially if you can get like multiple smartphones at different price points. Imagine being able to spend $200 on a smartphone that you can get a version of Graphene OS for, rather than having to spend like however much on a Pixel. There are paths forward. We just have to be able to to come together and take them. All right, let's continue. The collective quest for resilience also favors the sports industry, closely related to well-being. As it is now well understood that physical activity greatly contributes to health, sport will be increasingly recognized as a low-cost tool for a healthier society. Therefore, governments will encourage their practice, acknowledging the added benefit that sports constitute one of the best tools available for inclusivity and social integration. For a while, social distancing may constrain the practice of certain sports, which will in turn benefit the ever more powerful expansion of esports. Tech and digital are never far away. Oh, fucking hate esports. 4 industries that have been grappling with a host of particular challenges posed by the pandemic crisis illustrate the diverse nature of resilience. In banking, it is about being prepared for the digital transformation. In insurance, it is about being prepared for the litigations that are coming. That's fine. In automotive, it is about being prepared for the coming shortening of supply chains. In the electricity sector, is about being prepared for the inevitable energy transition. The challenges are the same within each industry, and only the most resilient and better prepared companies within each will be capable of engineering a successful outcome. Because of the nature of their activity, when an economic crisis happens, banks tend to find themselves in the epicenter of the storm. With COVID-19, the risk doubled in intensity. First, banks have to prepare for the possibility that the consumer liquidity crisis morphs into a major corporate solvency crisis, in which case their resilience will be severely tested. Second, they have to adjust to the way in which the pandemic is challenging traditional banking habits, a different form of resilience that requires further capacities of adaptation. The first risk belongs to the category of traditional financial risks, for which banks have had years to prepare. It is being dealt with through capital and liquidity buffers that have to be robust enough to withstand a major shock. I said I hate esports. Specifically esports. I fucking got a message. Fucking smart. I said I hate esports. I went to esports. Not sports in general. I've been going to the fucking gym. That's a cunt. In the case of the COVID-19 crisis, the test of resilience will come when the volume of non-performing loans starts rising. The situation is entirely different for the second category of risks. Almost overnight, retail, commercial, and investment banks were faced with an often unexpected situation of having to move online. The impossibility to meet colleagues, clients, or fellow traders in person, the necessity to use contactless payment, and the exhortation from regulators to use online banking and online trading in conditions of remote working all meant that the entire banking industry had to move towards digital banking at the stroke of a pen. COVID-19 has forced all the banks to accelerate a digital transformation that is now here to stay and that has intensified cybersecurity risks, which could in turn raise systemic stability implications if they are not properly mitigated. Those that have lagged behind and missed the high-speed digital train will find it very hard to adapt and survive. In the insurance industry, many different COVID-19 related claims have been made under various types of household and commercial insurance, which include commercial property and business interruption, travel, life, health, and liability, like workers' compensation and employment practices liability. The pandemic poses a particular risk to the insurance industry because its existence and functioning are based upon the principle of risk diversification, which was effectively suppressed when governments decided to impose a lockdown. For this reason, hundreds of thousands of businesses around the world have been unable to successfully file claims and are either facing months, if not years, of litigation or ruin. In May 2020, the insurance industry estimated that the pandemic potentially cost more than $200 billion, making it one of the most expensive events in the history of the insurance industry. The cost will rise if the lockdowns go beyond the period under consideration when the forecast was made. For the insurance industry, the post-COVID-19 challenge consists in meeting the evolving protection needs of its customers by building greater resilience to a broad range of potentially uninsurable catastrophic shocks like pandemics, extreme weather events, cyber attacks, and terrorism. It has to do so while navigating an environment of exceedingly low interest rates, while preparing for anticipated litigation and the possibility of unprecedented claims and losses. In the last few years, the automotive industry has been engulfed in a rising storm of challenges, ranging from trade and geopolitical uncertainty, declining sales and CO2 penalties, to fast changing customer demand and the multifaceted nature of the rising competition in mobility, electric vehicles, autonomous cars, shared mobility. The pandemic has exacerbated these challenges by adding to the considerable uncertainty the industry is facing, in particular with respect to supply chains. In the early stages of the outbreak, the shortage of Chinese components had a detrimental impact on global automotive production. In the coming months and years, the industry will have to rethink its whole organization and ways of operating against the backdrop of reduced supply chains and a likely drop in vehicle sales. Throughout the successive stages of the pandemic, and in particular during the lockdowns, the electricity sector played an essential role in allowing most of the world to carry on digitally, the hospitals to run, and all essential industries to operate normally. Despite the considerable challenges posed by cyber threats and changes in demand patterns, electricity held on, proving its resilience to shocks. Moving forward, the electricity sector has to embrace the challenge of accelerating its energy transition. The combination of investments in progressive energy infrastructure, like in renewables, hydrogen pipelines, and electric vehicle charging networks, and industrial cluster redevelopment, like the electrification of the energy required for chemical production, has the potential to support the economic recovery by creating employment and economic activity while increasing the overall resilience of the energy sector in terms of clean energy production. The micro reset will force every company in every industry to experiment new ways of doing business, working, and operating. Those tempted to revert to the old way of doing things will fail. Those that adapt with agility and imagination will eventually turn the COVID-19 crisis to their advantage. And that is chapter 2 of COVID-19, The Great Reset, done. Next week, next Tuesday, we will finish it off with chapter 3, the individual reset, and the conclusion. So, yeah, we will go with that. Of course, on Thursday, I will be on for the weekly gaming stream, where I will be continuing Freedom Planet, which I started last Thursday. So, I will see. So, with all that out of the way, I will see you guys either on Thursday for the gaming stream or next Tuesday, where we'll finish off COVID-19, the Great Reset. In 2 weeks, we'll begin Vladimir Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage, capitalism. See you guys next time.